Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. Today, my guest is Jared Klickstein. He wrote a book called Crooked Smile: What It Took to Escape a Decade of Homelessness, Addiction, and Crime. Crooked Smile details one man's journey that left him homeless on Skid Row and what it took to escape a decade of addiction. Darkly humorous is an understatement when it comes to this poignant tale of addiction, homelessness, incarceration, and eventual redemption. Jared Klickstein, the child of two heroin addicts who eventually became addicted himself, takes readers on a raw and personal journey from his unsettling and secretive childhood in the suburbs to the slums of Skid Row. Through tales of violence, relapse, and inner struggle, Klickstein provides a harrowing account of his personal encounter with near death, including what he calls dying in slow motion. How are you doing today, Jared?
Hey, I'm doing good, Nick. I'm honored to come on. This I read your book, The Franklin Scandal, and I was a huge fan, and yeah, just honored to talk with you today.
Great. And why don't you give us some background about your parents? And I think that the seeds of addiction were probably planted there.
Yeah, sure. I agree. Both my parents were heroin addicts, and eventually actually crack cocaine addicts. But they grew up relatively normal and working class homes in Boston, and they were children of the 60s. And I think with the Vietnam War, a lot of my dad's friends, older brothers were coming back from Vietnam addicted to heroin. And they didn't really know what heroin was back then, or at least my dad didn't. So they started experimenting. So, my parents were sort of, um, they'd go on and off heroin. And when they had me, they were actually off heroin. But when I was about 4 years old, they got back on heroin. And this led to a relatively tumultuous childhood. Um, but then again, I've met many people that have gotten clean from drugs that have had much worse childhoods. But yeah, it was definitely a part of my childhood.
And then there are people that have gotten clean from drugs that had a seemingly normal childhood.
Yeah, that's true. It's a pretty unbelievable affliction that seems to affect all kinds of people.
But I would say chances are, if someone's an addict or an alcoholic, they had a difficult time growing up. And
Yeah, yeah.
ultimately, you were sent to California to live with your aunt and uncle. How old were you at that point?
Yeah, so at around 12, things had gotten really bad. My parents had picked up crack cocaine when I was about 9. And that made heroin addiction look manageable. I mean, they really uh everything really changed. I mean, heroin is a very sleepy drug. It's a very calm drug. You will eventually go broke and, probably lose jobs and things like that. But crack cocaine brings an element of psychosis and paranoia that made my house unlivable for a child, really. So it had gotten very bad, and when I was 12, my aunt and uncle adopted me, and they lived in Oakland, California.
I've heard of people keeping it together as heroin addicts. I
Yeah,
think with heroin, you reach a certain point where you just kind of get straight and you can function.
yeah,
But after they became crack addicts, they were no longer able to function. I've seen that play out. Crack
yeah.
is an insidious drug. I'm also in recovery, but I got into recovery before the crack epidemic. And I was in Minneapolis and I just saw the ravages of crack. I mean, buildings were boarded up. And one of the things that really sticks out to me is young women would come to the University of Minnesota from small towns throughout Minnesota, and they would start smoking crack. And within a week or two or three, I mean, they'd be prostituting themselves. I mean, that's how powerful that drug is.
Yeah. Yeah, it's extremely powerful. And it's essentially cocaine, but I messed around with cocaine and I'd never, sell the shoes off of my own feet for a $5 bag of cocaine. But something about the route of administration with crack cocaine when you freebase cocaine, it's like demonic. I don't know. You take a hit and 10 minutes later you will do anything for more crack. And th this becomes a really big problem when you have money because you can actually afford it. And my parents, my dad was a carpenter and he made a pretty good wage in the union, but they also sort of did some drug trafficking and there was a surplus of like dirty money in my house and it all got spent on crack cocaine. And yeah, they were probably doing about $1,000 worth of crack every day each.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's a lot of rubles.
Yeah, well, eventually they lost the house and they lost everything, and it all got smoked.
Is that about the time you moved to Oakland?
Well, I moved to Oakland when I was 12, and by the time I was like 13 or 14, they'd gone through everything and had to sell the house. And my mom actually passed when I think I was 14. My mom overdosed on heroin, and that's when the house got sold, and my dad moved to Florida and basically attempted to get clean, but sort of just went on like a 5 year, bender.
And you went to school in Oakland. Was your were your school years relatively sane?
Yeah, my aunt and uncle that adopted me are very normal. They're not working class. I'd say they're upper middle class. My aunt married a doctor, and we lived in a pretty nice neighborhood. And I was raised around, my friends' parents were successful, and there wasn't hard drug use in my high school, but there was a lot of drinking, and I was an alcoholic, by at that point. I wouldn't drink every day, but I'd drink at any opportunity I could drink, and sort of gravitated towards like the worst kids at my school. But I did well, and I actually enjoyed school, and I tried pretty hard in school, and I got pretty good grades, and held it together. But definitely had some consequence, like legal consequences, some suspensions, things like that.
I had a malevolent stepfather starting at about 6. And I think that probably I would live in a certain amount of anxiety with him. And that anxiety was amped a little bit. I ran away when I was 12. He was beating me up in the living room. And then my mom came in and said, "Don't hit him with a closed fist." And
Yeah.
I said, "Whoa." I was only 12, but I said, "I am not safe here." So I took, but I didn't get far that time because I was fortunate. I mean, a lot of bad things can happen to 12-year-olds that are
Yeah.
out on the streets. And and then I was sent to a military school, and I had yet to pick up at that point. But the military school was the anxiety got ratcheted up. That place was very sick and very violent. The two primary texts were Lord of the Flies and the Bible. And
Yeah.
so I had a lot of anxiety. And then I smoked some weed when I was 14. And then all that anxiety just evaporated. I mean, it was like the clouds parted and there were shafts of light coming down on me, angels with harps. I mean, it was an unbelievably liberating thing.
Yeah.
And that's when I started dedicating myself to working on recovery or,
Yeah.
or moving towards recovery.
Yeah, no, same. I mean, I found alcohol and it was like I found a substance that made me not have to think about the fact that my parents were crackheads and heroin addicts. I mean, it made me it like numbed my identity and I didn't have to acknowledge who I was and a lot of people my age that started drinking, they drink to enhance their experience. They drink at a party or something like that. Whereas I did not drink to enhance my experience. I drank and I smoked weed to numb reality for, 6 to 12 hours. And that's not a good sign if that's why you're, drinking or getting high.
And you did fairly well in high school.
Yeah. Yeah.
I did not do fairly well in high school, but you did. And then you went to college. What college did you go to?
I went to UC Santa Cruz. I don't know if many people have heard of it. Um, it's associated with UCLA, UC Berkeley. It's just a state university in California.
And what were your plans? What were you going to major in?
Well, growing up with my aunt and uncle, they knew that I was bad. I was up to sort of no good, but they said, "Listen, if you get good grades, we won't kick you out." So I just had to. That's sort of the reason why I did well in high school. So it was expected that you will go to college. You have to. You have to get out of here. You can't live here, because you're not the best behaved kid. So I went to college really just as a way to get out and just, live somewhere. But yeah, my intention was I played music and I was, my real plan was just to join a band and, tour with a band and try to get famous, which is, not very easy. And, it definitely wasn't a good era either to be attempting to do that. Bands, as far as I know, are sort of non-existent at this point. But I just wanted to get through. I majored in history. Um, I actually first majored in community studies because someone told me it was the easiest major, and that was sort of like the beginning of what we're seeing now, like with the um, sort of like politically leftist leaning college kids. I mean, I basically majored in that for about a year, and I didn't really like it, so I switched to history with no real plan.
So did you fall asleep while you were pursuing woke?
Yeah, I guess fortunately, because by 18, 19, I was like messing around with Oxycontin, and that was it. Like I immediately dedicated my life to Oxycontin. And fortunately, I just to remain at the school, I had to still show up and pass. So I sort of was asleep during all 4 years, which was probably good. I don't think I would have learned anything super constructive. Um, when I was in that community studies program. But um, by the end of by sophomore year, like 19, like halfway through my 19th year of life, I was really strung out on Oxycontin, and Oxycontin was really expensive, and it was actually pretty hard to get at that point. And heroin was everywhere, and it was for some reason it was much easier to get than Oxycontin, and it was much cheaper. Um, so I made the switch. I made the switch to heroin and basically just majored. I basically majored in heroin is the best way to put it.
And was that the brown Mexican, I'm surmising?
Yeah, it was like $30 a gram and it was really bad, really low quality Mexican black tar heroin. And when I turned 20, all of a sudden that $30 a gram stuff sort of disappeared and now it was like 90, $100 a gram and it was probably 10 to 20 times more potent. So, and this was more of a gunpowder tan. It was sort of like a tan powder that when heat was applied, it would turn into tar. So it was still Mexican tar. It was just much higher quality.
When after I graduated from high school, I started hitchhiking around the country. That was kind of uh, the thing to do when back in my youth, or ute, as might be said in certain Brooklyn circles. And I had a good time. I hitchhiked for about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years. I've been hitchhiking before that, but when I started my transcontinental hitchhiking um,
Yeah.
at about 18. And that was quite an adventure for me. Back then, Jack Kerouac wrote a book called The Dharma Bums.
Yeah.
And Dharma is the Pali word for truth, and bum is the American word for bum. And I noticed that my fellow Dharma bums, their Dharma was greatly receding as they got older, which really only leaves you bum. So at about 22, I decided to go to college.
Well, it's never too late.
And I studied philosophy, which was the right thing for me to study because it interested me. And there weren't a lot of tests for philosophy. You could write papers, and that suited me well too. So, but eventually, my substance abuse got out of control again. Well, I was going, and I dropped out of the University of Minnesota. I mean, I eventually went back there, but I know what that's like. I mean, to have a solid idea of what you want to do, but then all of a sudden addiction kicks in and just kind of leaves it in shambles.
Yeah. No, totally. I mean, I had thoughts of like going to law school or something. I had an uncle that was a lawyer, and I sort of like de facto just decided that I would just pursue the same path. But upon, discovering heroin, everything was just like, how can I get to tomorrow? I don't care at all about where I am in 5 years or 10 years. It's just I need heroin right now. And and I became an expert at heroin and acquiring it. And and yeah, that's basically what I did in college. And in my senior year, I got an opportunity to my drug dealer, who was like they were like Mexican nationals, and they were nice guys and everything, but they like were associated with the cartel and all that. They they offered me a job to drive around Santa Cruz and sell heroin for them, and they gave me a walkie-talkie, and they would basically, I would traffic heroin, I guess is the term that they would use. But yeah, so when I did that, they gave me the job under one condition, that I start snorting methamphetamine, because they were scared that I would fall asleep while driving. And then, you crash and you have their heroin in your car, it's going to be a problem for them. So I had to use meth. And
So
I
you
got into
learned
meth.
about alchemy.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, so that was like the second half of my senior year. I started doing meth, and pretty quickly, couldn't even make it to class, and got kicked out of college. And my entire life unraveled within a month or two of using meth.
And you're at the age where you would have intersected with fentanyl too.
Yeah, I did. This was like 2010, 2011. By the end of my run, I had encountered fentanyl. So I got sober in 2018. Um, and fentanyl was on the scene at that point, but it hadn't completely taken over probably until 2019, 2020. Um, but yeah, I did encounter it.
But 25 years ago, I wrote an article about fentanyl patches.
Yeah,
And I thought to myself, this is a bad idea. Fentanyl is 100 times more potent than heroin. And I
yeah.
thought, this is opening a Pandora's box. I knew that fentanyl would probably lead to carnage, but I had no idea of the kind of carnage that it would cause.
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, so yeah, around this time, there was fentanyl, but it was pharmaceutical fentanyl in the form of these patches. And of course, we always preferred heroin, but sometimes someone scored 3 patches or something, and you do them, and you could smoke them. I mean, you could smoke these patches, or you could, just put them in your mouth, or you could just apply them, on your skin. And they were they felt as powerful as heroin in these very, very minuscule doses that they would put in these patches. And then I never foresaw that, like the cartel would start, utilizing fentanyl and sort of replace heroin with it. But good on you for calling that out. I mean, it has completely ravaged the entire opiate scene, and heroin is relatively difficult to find now, actually. It's all fentanyl.
So you were working for drug dealers and they fired you for being high all the time. That's kind of
Yeah,
an
that
irony.
basically. Yeah. Well, they told me that I had to snort meth to work for them before my shifts, but I began, when I would get off of my shift, I would partake in meth, and they told me I was to never smoke it. They said smoke. They believed that smoking meth was much more harmful than snorting it, and and I did start smoking it, and I don't know if they were correct. I mean, I think snorting meth is also pretty dangerous and can definitely induce a sense of psychosis, but smoking it seems to get you to that point a little quicker. And I started accusing them of, working with the CIA and all this kind of stuff. And they said, okay, he's smoking it, he's fired. And they fired me. And I worked for them for a few months.
Those Mexican cartels don't place a high premium on life a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's best not to get them angry at you.
Yeah. And they weren't angry, and they had guns, and they were, scary guys and all that. But they didn't, I don't think murdering me would have done them any good, so they just said, you know what, you're fired, and you can't buy drugs from us anymore. We don't want you to call us anymore. And I'm very grateful that that's the path that they took with that.
And that began your descent into Skid Row.
Yeah. Yeah. So I got kicked out of school. I eventually had no housing. I was living with other students, and my family at that point had found out. They knew that I was on drugs. I was completely whacked on meth and heroin, and they basically said, we don't want anything to do with you, because we went through this with your parents. We can't emotionally afford to do this with you for 10 years. I mean, come to us when you're serious, but for now you're just on your journey. And I had an uncle in Los Angeles that said, I'll give you one chance. And he let me come down. He bought me a Greyhound bus ticket. I went down there, and he got me into a rehab because I still had university insurance. And he said, if you fuck that up, don't call me. This is your one chance. And I did, I screwed that up, and I kept getting high, and they kicked me out. And I was in Los Angeles, which I wasn't incredibly familiar with, but I knew that if you're homeless in Los Angeles, you go to Skid Row. That's where you go. That's where I was buying drugs already when I was living at that rehab. So I went down to Skid Row in 2011.
In Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, two guys are sitting at a bar, and one guy goes to the other guy, how did you go bankrupt? And the other guy goes, well, two ways, gradually and then suddenly. And I think that's how people go homeless. It's often gradually and then suddenly.
Oh, totally. I mean, because gradually you start reaching out for help, and maybe you get a couch to live on for a few weeks, or a family member takes you in, or something like that. And then if you happen to be a drug addict and homeless, most people don't want you around for very long, because you end up stealing something from them, or just sort of lying, or you tell them you're going to get a job, and you're just out looking for heroin, and then all of a sudden suddenly you're homeless. That's pretty much how it works.
Shortly after I moved to New York, a friend of mine that I knew in high school called me. He was living in New York and he had become a heroin addict. And he asked me if he could live with me. And I was really, I had like influenza. I was really sick. I had like about 102 fever. And, I told him no. And he ultimately wasn't, I mean, he was never willing to to really give sobriety a chance and a recovery a chance. And he eventually OD'd on heroin. And he was such a talented guy. He was a good-looking guy. He was a smart guy, funny. His dad was a judge. And when I read about him, I felt really bad. But at that point, I knew that recovery wasn't in the cards for him. And I just didn't want to let him into my life because it was just going to be chaotic. And I recently moved here. I was working on getting a freelance writing career together also. And my place was small at that point. And I I don't feel guilt over that, but because I tried to get him into recovery before, and he just it wasn't in his lexicon. And if he had come to me and he'd said, I'm really going to do it this time, I think I probably wouldn't let him stay with me. But he it sounded to me like he had no um, motivation whatsoever to get into recovery. And you know, it's putting up a junkie is an arduous experience. I've
Oh
done
yeah.
it before. And so yeah. But it's such a waste. And there are so many people that have lost their lives. Really talented, smart people because of drugs. And people look up to William Burroughs and Jack Kerouac and Keith Richard as the paragon of what they want to be. But for every William Burroughs or Jack Kerouac or Keith Richard, there's probably like 500,000 dead addicts trying to be William Burroughs, Jack Kerouac, or Keith Richard.
Yeah, definitely. I've met countless incredibly talented people, and I moved to New York after Skid Row, after my first time on Skid Row, and a friend, and I did the same thing. I asked a friend if I could stay with him. He had like a little tiny studio apartment, and he was sober at the time, and he said yes, and I moved in, and within about a week he was back on heroin, and we both did heroin, and I basically leached off this guy for like 6 months, and he eventually moved, and that was sort of his way of kicking me out, and he's sober now, but like I basically leached off this guy, and who knows? I mean, he could have overdosed because I got him back on heroin. I mean, I didn't purposely get him back on heroin, but it's hard for a clean heroin addict to let another heroin addict live with them is not a great recipe. Um, and I just remember living in New York, and I got Junkie by William S. Burroughs, and I'd read it over and over again, and I thought I was going to be William S. Burroughs, and I don't know how great of an influence he really was on me, but eventually I got clean, and I did write a book, but I kind of thought I could have my cake and eat it too by reading William S. Burroughs because he basically had this great career, but never stopped doing heroin.
Well, he at a certain point he did stop doing heroin, but he was very
Okay.
much an alcoholic. He was
Yeah.
also into Aleister Crowley's OTO. Very strange guy, and he also shot his wife in the head,
Yeah, he did do that.
which I mean, he's a hero to a lot of junkies, but um, shooting your wife in the head is really not a good thing to do.
No, 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 it's terrible. But he was fascinated with like the science of how he could get off heroin. And I remember reading in the back of Junkie, he had written all these papers on he had like built a box with a magnifying glass on the top of it, and you'd get into the box and the sun would magnify onto you. And that was like his theory of how he could finally get off heroin. And he was doing all these experiments to get off heroin. And I found it fascinating.
He had a orgone box.
Okay, so that's what now is that Aleister Crowley stuff?
No, that's William Reich. He
Okay.
was the second wave of Freudians.
Okay.
And Wilhelm Reich took libido much further, and he said that orgone
Hmm.
was was the power in the universe. And he designed these orgone boxes where, I mean, it was just like plywood and tin and things like that. But he said that they would shrink tumors. And the FDA begged to differ with him and put him in prison. And his last book, because he thought that people, that the common man would rally to his defense because he was going to eradicate cancer and tumors and various blights with the orgone box. And his last book, when no one came to his defense, his last book was called Listen, Little Man. So I think he was a little bitter, but he lost it. He was a brilliant guy. I mean, you read his stuff and he's a brilliant guy, but definitely lost his mind somewhere along the line. And
Yeah,
you
that's
referred to yourself as a reptile.
yeah.
Why do you refer to yourself as a reptile?
Well, I don't feel like a reptile right now, but when I was on drugs, it now I not in the moment I didn't feel like one, but looking back once I had gotten clean, you sort of become cold-blooded and you don't really care about there's no like humanity to your objective. I mean, you wake up and you need to figure out how to get high and you will sacrifice anything to do so and you will destroy any human relationship, you will rob anybody um, just to get $20. And it just looking back at it, it felt like almost like the attitude of like an alligator or something like that. Just that there was I would destroy a 20-year relationship with a family member or a friend for a few dollars, and that was me. I mean, not all heroin addicts are like this, or not all drug addicts, but when you reach the level of like terminal addiction is really what it is. And those are a lot of people on Skid Row have like a terminal state of addiction. Um, that is what they're experiencing, in my opinion. And these people are really hard to help because you want to like move them into your garage or move them onto your couch, but they will ultimately disappoint you unless they find recovery. And sometimes you helping them, I mean, this is like the darkest thing about it is like sometimes you helping them can actually delay them finding recovery uh, if you are helping them in the wrong way, which is incredibly unfortunate.
When you're dealing with addiction and you want to help someone, it can be a razor's edge for sure.
Yeah, yeah,
But the reptilian brain, the limbic system, at a certain point, alcoholics and addicts live to fire that part of the brain up, and it registers pleasure.
yeah,
Even though the pleasure is very fleeting and becomes almost non-existent at a certain point. With heroin, you're just trying to, a lot of times you're just trying to stay away from withdrawals. You're just trying to get straight. And that's a lot of work just to try to get straight.
yeah, yeah, totally. It's it kind of it brings you back to it because now your only objective is to satisfy one desire, and that is to in a sense it's to eat. You're if that's like what we our ancient ancestors and all that. I mean that was the main objective, was to eat and fulfill that desire of hunger, and fulfilling the desire to get straight and avoid withdrawals is extremely similar and almost um, more dire. I mean, the pain of withdrawals is something that it can't really be described, and you really have to go through it to understand the full capacity of it. And And yeah, you're right. You're not really ch you're chasing pleasure at first, but at a certain point, you're just chasing the ability to stave off withdrawals, and the amount you're willing to sacrifice to get that little tiny payoff. I mean, the gap between those two things expands rapidly as addiction progresses, and it's very dark. And sometimes it has to get to that point for some of us to really be willing to actually get clean.
I was pretty hard-headed myself, and I had to go through a tremendous amount of pain before I was willing. You talked about the various health issues that you had during your homelessness, and you ultimately ended up with staph infection, I believe, MRSA, and you were in the hospital.
Yeah, I've had MRSA probably over 10 times. I mean, I've definitely had staph infections dozens of times. But specifically MRSA, I've gone to the hospital for MRSA probably 10 times. Um, once you get it, it seems like you sort of become a magnet for it. I don't know. But it's definitely a combination of sleeping outside and using meth or crack cocaine. I mean, something about stimulants sort of dehydrates you, and part of this dehydration um, leads to the death of like little critters that crawl on you that are actually good, like the pro like the sort of like probiotics. I mean, there are things that are part of our immune system that are good for us that die from when you yourself become dehydrated. So it seems like when I was homeless and just using heroin, I never got staph infection. But when I was homeless and using stimulants, I'd contract MRSA and other staph infections.
And then your dad suddenly gets clean in Florida, and you
Yeah.
go to Florida to visit him and end up in I believe, a rehab, right?
Yeah, well, he went to jail in Florida, and he was released from jail, and they had lost his shoes. So he had no shoes and no car, and was sort of at the end of the line. I mean, if you don't have shoes in Florida, it's not that great. It's pretty hot, and there's a lot of asphalt in Florida. So it is not a good place to not have shoes. And he sort of hit the end of his road, and made some phone calls and got the number to his sober living. And this was not really a rehab. It was more of a place where you'd move in with no money, and then if you got a job within 3 weeks, you could stay, and then you'd start paying rent. And it was a program to some extent, but there was freedom, and you had to go out and get a job and go work. And I had sort of run I'd kind of ended up at the end of my road in California, and I had made contact with him, and he said, well, I'll get you a Greyhound ticket out to Florida, and you can join this sober living and get a job and do the same thing that he did. And that's what I did. I went out there, and I actually went out there a few times, so I'd basically go out there, do the program, save up a few grand after, like 6 months, stay sober, and then I'd leave. I'd leave with like 2 grand, and usually end up homeless again. And and I came back a few times. And he had so throughout my many times of going back, or my several times, he had remained sober, and his life just got better and better, and it got incredibly stable, and his health had come back, and he sort of flourished. And I was witnessing this as I kept leaving and ruining my life again. I'd come back, and he'd look even healthier, and have a better life than last time.
And then you came to New York City, which is a very good place to hit bottom because you've got so many options that are
Yeah.
going to help you hit bottom.
Yeah, yeah. So after one of these times of going to my dad's sober living, I saved up a few grand, and I moved to New York City, and with the plan of living with that friend. I sort of showed up at his building and called him, and he I manipulated him, and he let me move in with him, and we pretty quickly we got back on heroin. And this was in 2013, so it was a different New York City. There was a wind, as you know, New York is a really tough, it's a tough city. Um, but sort of after the Giuliani and Bloomberg day, or during the Giuliani and the Bloomberg days, um, it sort of became a very authoritarian city, and it was very difficult to commit crimes and to do any sort of shenanigans. And I lived there during that period, and New York City was the first place where I went to jail. Um, I went to jail for hopping the turnstile. And
That's quite a felony.
yeah, well, it was my second time. So the first time they gave me a ticket, the second time they took me to jail.
Those computers, they have good memories.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And
Were you in the tombs or
no, I ended up in some like holding cell in Brooklyn,
okay?
just for 12 hours or whatever. And I ended up in jail there a few times, for things like this. And I never went to Rikers Island or anything. I was always in Brooklyn, so I would end up at some holding cell in Brooklyn, um and it would sort of scare me. And I was like, oh man, I have to really stop doing heroin and stop doing these little crimes to get my heroin, or else I'm probably going to end up at Rikers Island or end up in prison in New York. And that I didn't have a fun time in the holding cells. I mean, there was very scary people, and and I did not want to go to jail or prison. And I couldn't. I ended up homeless there very briefly, but it was actually illegal to be homeless at that time, and you'd go to jail. So I had to go to the shelter. I went to a shelter on like First Avenue and 30th Street or something, somewhere around there.
Was that the Midnight Mission?
No, no, this was just some New York City shelter, and they I eventually did was living there and got a job and sort of stabilized to some extent, but couldn't get off heroin, and New York basically chewed me up and sort of spit me out, and I uh, I went back to California. I went back to Los Angeles, and ended up on Skid Row again.
And then you ended up at the Midnight Mission.
Exactly, yeah. So the Midnight Mission was on Skid Row, and that was a shelter that also offered a rehabilitation program, which was the second floor of the shelter, and it was very, it was rule based. There was a lot of rules. You couldn't just leave. It was a program, and I was there for probably 6 months, and it was one of the greatest 6 months of my life. And I detoxed there, not medically. I just detoxed cold turkey from heroin, and lived with like 200 guys, all Skid Row homeless guys, and celebrities would come, like Mr. T and Dick Van Dyke, and let me think, Smokey Robinson came one time. I mean, like all these celebrities would come because it was sort of a mainstay of Los Angeles. It was an institution, and celebrities would come and volunteer and hand out meals to homeless people, and it's a great program. But I did eventually get high and get kicked out.
And you said this place had prison showers and daily rations of toilet paper.
Yeah,
Honestly,
yeah.
it's the way a rehab should be. Daily rations of toilet paper. I've never heard of that. Um,
Well, yeah, there was no toilet paper rolls because people would steal the toilet because people were homeless, that were entering this place. So it's a mentality when you're homeless, you want to hoard things because it's like entrenched in your mind that you could run out of some kind of good or like toilet paper, or if there's like soap, you might steal a bar of soap. It's not that these people are bad, it's that It's the mentality of being homeless. You know, you need to acquire supplies. And, so they had a problem with people stealing toilet paper. So you'd actually have to go and get they'd spin you out like a couple feet of toilet paper and they'd give it to you.
Well, that would be very, very difficult for someone withdrawing from drugs that had diarrhea.
Exactly. Well, they were very generous with my toilet paper rations the
Okay,
first
that's
I
good.
was there. Yeah, yeah.
That's important. As long as they were flexible with toilet paper,
Oh, of course. I mean, of
that's an
course. Yeah.
important thing.
Yeah. But th they were there to train you to sort of get back into like the daily routine of being a normal per, you wake up, you eat breakfast, you take a shower, you make your bed. They were training us to sort of get back in the mentality of normality. Um, because a lot of us there are people that were very long-term homeless and you sort of adopt an entirely new mentality of homelessness and like I said, we're not bad people or anything, but it's a real it's like a Lord of the Flies type situation when you're out there on Skid Row, you know. So yeah, I thought it was a really good program in that way. And they'd help you build a resume, they'd help you get a nice suit to go out on job interviews and there was even options for school. They'd help you, there were people that couldn't read. They had a school, they had a teacher that would come in and volunteer and help people, learn how to write and read and do basic math and things like that. And yeah, it was just a very solid program.
And then you had a particularly bad night and you prayed to God or whoever or whatever. And I think you were very nebulous about that to either kill you or incarcerate you.
Yeah, so when I left the Midnight Mission, I didn't really attempt to get back in and just sort of went on a very wild, dark run on Skid Row for like the better part of a year. And it was much more gruesome than my prior run on Skid Row in terms of violence, in terms of depravity, in terms of drug use. I mean, I was stealing, I was professionally shoplifting and making probably $300 to $400 a day, which was giving me it really amped up my drug use, having all that money. And yeah, I found myself in like a cement stairwell of some sort of an outdoor stairwell of some, building or parking structure, and I was unable to inject heroin. I had sort of run out of veins, and I was bleeding everywhere, and couldn't, I was trying to shoot in my ankles, my hands, my neck. I had completely run out of spots, and I never really believed in God or anything, but I prayed to something. I believe in God now, but it's sort of my own interpretation of it. But I just prayed. I said, "Hey, I need you either got to kill me or you got to send me to prison. I don't know how else I can do this. I need to. I really wanted to go to prison, but I really didn't want a violent criminal record, and that's probably the easiest way to go to prison is to be violent and get arrested. So I didn't want to do that. So I sort of wanted this perfect situation where I could go to prison but not actually get anything on my record, which is pretty hard to do.
And then you were in and out of sobriety and you all of a sudden had a crooked smile. Tell us
Yes.
about your crooked smile.
Yeah, so well anyway, after that I went to jail for 6 months and that was I guess that's sort of besides the point. But it turns out jail does not bring you to recovery. It will separate you from drugs for a long time, but that doesn't mean that you will be able to stay off drugs when you get out. And I found that out and ended up getting high again right after getting out of jail and I started blacking out when I'd get high. I'd start injecting heroin and meth at the same time and I would have these blackouts and during one blackout I actually had been clean for like 3 months or something and I relapsed. I shot up some heroin and meth. I blacked out and about 8 hours later I woke up and I was missing part of my face. And not a huge part, but I was missing sort of my bottom lip all the way down to like the cleft of my chin. And this was a mystery, but I pretty quickly solved it. I looked in the mirror and I realized that I had chewed my face off. And and I'm not that kind of guy. I'm a pretty normal, calm guy when I'm not on drugs, but on drugs, I had apparently done this incredibly horrific thing. And I don't know how. And it started with some kind of altercation. There was signs that I would gotten into a fight with somebody in a blackout, and maybe they had really beaten up my lip really badly, or maybe they had sliced my lip or something like that. And I had started biting at the wound in a blackout, and had broken into a boarding house where there was a bathroom at the end of the hallway, and I had kind of camped up in the tub and done this to myself. And it was the worst moment of my life waking up in this condition. So I actually had money, so I went and purposely overdosed on heroin. I'd wrapped my face up and bought enough heroin to kill myself, and I did. I shot it in a public bathroom and overdosed.
And you were revived by medics and put into a rehab program in a hospital.
Yeah, yeah. So I was revived. Someone had discovered my body. They called the police or the medical emergency number or whatever, and I got Narcaned and I got brought back to life. And they took me to USC Keck Hospital. It's a hospital associated with the USC school, and and they had never really seen anything like this. But since it was associated with USC and there was some medical students, they agreed to actually practice on me and do some reconstructive plastic surgery. And over the span of, I think, 7 months, they did three surgeries for free, and they rebuilt my face. These students, and and fortunately, I had a friend who, at that point, I was very serious about getting off drugs and recovery, and they believed me at that point, because I had done this to myself. So they did let me live with them for 7 months while I got these surgeries, and then after my final surgery, I went to a long-term nonprofit rehab in Los Angeles, where I was introduced to recovery. And now I'd been introduced before, but this was the first time that I was introduced to recovery when I was actually completely open-minded to it and desired to get off drugs permanently.
I was fortunate. I hit a pretty brutal bottom relatively early. And I said to myself, I will never, ever end up like this again, ever. And I've been in recovery for 39 years now, and I've never ended up like that again. And it's kind of funny, my greatest fear with sobriety is that I would have a boring life.
Yeah.
And I've never been bored. And sobriety, and actually towards the end of my uh, using, life was really boring and very brutal. So I, I I don't know what I was thinking about, but I mean, when you're in that headspace of addiction, you think of a lot of crazy things that make sense at the time.
Yeah. Yes.
That's like a famous last word. Well, it made sense at the time.
Yeah, no, I mean, listen, it made sense at the time for me to go get high that time that I woke up missing part of my face. It made sense at the time. We kind of lie to ourselves, but yeah, you make a good point. Like the end of an addict's run with uh, drug use and alcoholism before they get clean, is both incredibly boring and brutal somehow. Somehow it can be incredibly brutal and boring at the same time, because it's incredibly repetitive. It's just, you're not really doing anything but satisfying your desire to consume drugs and alcohol, it's quite uneventful actually. And I was very scared when I got sober that I was going to have a terribly boring life. But it's been nothing like that at all. I mean, I've done amazing things, and I've reconnected with my family, and I've developed several careers. I've had like career trajectories that I never thought I'd have. I've traveled. I wrote a book. I've had all kinds of new friends I have like a network of friends that I could never dream of when I was drug. I mean, when you're a drug addict, it's pretty hard to have any friends. You really just have associates. Um, so yeah, I mean, people always think that, and especially young people, you try to get sober at 21, 22, you're really scared about having this terribly boring life for the rest of your life. And uh, I've never seen it be the case with anyone, you know?
And you've been clean for 6.5 years.
Yeah, 6.5 years.
The end game with alcoholism or addiction is also unbelievably lonely.
Oh yeah.
At the end, I was starving for love. I had drifted very, very far away from love. And I define a spiritual invalid as someone who's incapable of giving and receiving love. And I was approaching being a spiritual invalid because I just drifted very far away from love and truth for that matter. Truth had I studied philosophy in the pursuit of truth to a certain degree, and I drifted very, very far away from truth, which has always meant a lot to me. My values had become completely skewed. And I walked out of that life, and I've never, ever thought to myself, well, there was kind of nostalgic and it wasn't all that bad. When I walked out of that life, I was so done with it that I've never had problems. I've never, I mean, some of the stories that I could tell are pretty funny, but I've never romanticized it and I've never wanted to go back.
Yeah. No, totally. I some would say that the cure for addiction is love. In the form of, some would say spirituality, and others would say community. I agree. I mean, I was incapable of receiving or giving love. I couldn't maintain any sort of relationship that wasn't completely based on what I could get out of you, and uh, and at that point, I could only maintain relationships with people that were in the same boat, that only maintained relationships with me for what they could get out of me. And and going to that long-term nonprofit rehab, I'd lost all my family and all that, but I was basically handed an opportunity to have a community of love and support and selflessness. And through that, time passes, and you eventually, if you still have family that's alive, I mean, like a lot of people get that family back. And I got that family back, and now I have, 100 people in my contacts list on my phone that I could call right now and talk about anything, and we unconditionally love each other.
That is one of the beautiful things about recovery is you find people that are really vying very hard to improve themselves.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of support. My relationship with most of my family has been tenuous over the years. But I created there's a lot of people in my life that I love and who love me. And I'm forever grateful for that. And I went back to college. Actually, I'd been kicked out of the University of Minnesota, and through an unbelievable fortuitous chain of events, I went back to the University of Minnesota and finished my uh, undergrad degree, and then went to graduate school. And then I wasn't in graduate school very long, and then I was hired by the Center for Biomedical Ethics. Uh, and I really it enabled me to use, because I did gain a lot of knowledge in philosophy, and I love philosophy. And there I had an opportunity to actually apply philosophy to real problems. within science and medicine. And it was, and they were, I can't believe it that they started me at 12.50 an hour. And then I quickly went up to 25 an hour. And this is a number of years ago, but I thought to myself, I can't believe I'm getting paid for doing something that I enjoy to do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing.
And I've been a writer ever since. And when you venture into stories like Franklin, there's never boredom.
Oh, I can only imagine.
And you said that you've done some traveling.
Yeah. Yeah, I have.
Where have you traveled to?
Since getting off drugs, I've actually only left the country one time. I went to Guadalajara, Mexico, but I've done a lot of domestic travel and I've driven all over America. Um, I'd never really seen a ton of America before. I mean, I guess I had taken a lot of cross-country Greyhound trips, but I was mostly withdrawing from heroin whenever I was on a cross-country Greyhound trip and wasn't really paying attention to what was outside. But yeah, I've traveled all over the Southwest, the Northeast, done some traveling through the South, um, Pacific Northwest. I mean, I've really hit every corner, just seeing just seeing America. Um, and then I went to Guadalajara and I loved it. I mean, people were like, people in Guadalajara were like, "Hey, it's really dangerous here. You should be really careful." And I would go out and it seemed way safer to me than Oakland, California. You know.
Well, Oakland can have some problems. You can have some problems in Oakland
Could
for
have,
sure.
yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm sure you can have them in Guadalajara too, but everyone was really nice and it seemed safe.
When I moved to New York, I got a gig as a science reporter. And that was a good time because they would fly me all over. And I'd report on science conferences. And I've always loved science. I think science is essentially the infant of philosophy. Philosophy gave birth to science. I mean, science ultimately devoured philosophy, but philosophy nonetheless gave birth to science. And I thought to myself again, here I am traveling around and going all over Europe, and I'm getting paid well and writing these articles. It was it was wonderful. I couldn't believe that I was having such a interesting life.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you people get off drugs and dreams come true, but not only that, like dreams that you didn't even have come true. I mean, you didn't even know they were within you. You do a lot of people will get a life beyond their wildest dreams. My life has gone in a path that I had I mean, I just wanted a job and an apartment. That's all I wanted when I got clean. And I've gotten so much more. I wanted cable and like a dog and just a job. That's a pretty low bar. So it made everything else that came with it um, just things I could never even imagine, like getting the opportunity to be a good son, reconnecting with my aunt and uncle that had adopted me and like being there for just changing like a light bulb in their house or something. It's like beyond my wildest dreams. Like the fact that I can go help them with things that I'm even allowed in the house, things like that.
It's wonderful to show up for people.
Yeah.
And I'd completely abrogated those responsibilities. Um, and once I got into recovery, I realized how important it is to show up for people. I mean, that's where real friendships are bonded, is helping people through difficult times.
Yeah, exactly.
In the other world, if someone's going through a difficult time, you don't really want to go down with the ship. So, um, I mean,
Yeah.
I would help people when it was convenient, but if I had to bend over backwards too far, then I wasn't of much use. But that is what I found is what really bonds people is helping people through hard times or them helping you through hard times.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, when you're helping people without wanting anything in return or any kind of benefit, I mean, that's where real relationships form, and that's why, families are usually very close because that's for a lot of people the only people they'd be willing to do something like that for are family. Um, but recovery introduced me to this world of doing that for friends, and I've done. I mean, in the world of recovery, you help people that maybe you just met. I mean, it's a crazy community in that way, because you relate with them, whether you've met them once or 100 times. I mean, you both suffer from this affliction that affects you to your spiritual core, and you just immediately relate with them, and there's a willingness to help people like that, even if you get nothing in return.
Jared, I really want to thank you for coming on the Nick Bryant podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm honored. I'm very honored and had a great time.
And I'm very happy that you no longer have a crooked smile.
Yeah, they fixed it. You can still see the scar and everything, but I'm actually grateful that they didn't fix it perfectly. I like I wouldn't change a thing. I'm indebted to those students and indebted to society, and I couldn't be more grateful.
Have yourself a great night.
Okay, you too.
Okay, bye.
Bye.